Whether it be through Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign or the beginning of America's role in the global economy with the tobacco cash crop, drugs have always been a prevalent part of American history and society. Some drugs were imported and established in the country, while others were developed and spread in our own backyard. Today, many modern issues surround drug use and addiction. Tracing the history of drugs in America can help us understand our position on the issue today. Let's start with one of the major contributors to the foundation of America, starting with the colonies: tobacco.
Tobacco. Although Christopher Columbus discovered tobacco being used among the Native Americans in 1492, tobacco's first role in American history was in the colonial economy. To make money and keep their colony afloat, settlers of Jamestown grew tobacco as a cash crop in 1612. It was the most successful out of all crops and brought in substantial revenue. In 1614, King George made the import of tobacco available for $14,000 a year. In 1727, tobacco notes became a legal form of money in Virginia, exchanging based on quality and quantity of tobacco being sold. In 1761, the first clinical study on tobacco's potentially deadly side effects was performed by Dr. Percival Potts. 1804 to 1806, Lewis and Clark used tobacco as gifts of life insurance to all that they find on their journey, showing how valuable tobacco has become to American society. The first commercial cigarettes were made in North Carolina and sold in 1865 to soldiers at the end of the Civil War. The cigarette-making machine was invented in 1881, making 120,000 cigarettes per day and smoking a truly widespread part of American culture. During World War II, cigarettes were sold every day overseas for free to male soldiers and to newly independent working women as well. By 1944, cigarette production was up to 300 billion a year. In 1965, the Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act made every tobacco product have a Surgeon General warning saying that smoking could be hazardous to your health. The tar wars began in the 1980s when major tobacco companies began competing to see who can make the lowest tar cigarettes. In the 1990s, smoking was outlawed on airplanes on flights that are 6 hours or less. Summary: tobacco started out in America as something beneficial for the economy and cash crops, to realizing the health effects of tobacco and the American mission to try and reduce smoking among the population.
Marijuana, though initially thought of as a bad drug, also serves the purpose of medicine. The role of marijuana has greatly developed since 1545. In 1545, the Spanish brought marijuana to the New World. The English introduced it in Jamestown in 1611. In 1545, cannabis spread to the Western Hemisphere, where Spaniards imported it to Chile for its use as fiber. In North America, cannabis, in the form of hemp, was grown on many plantations for use in rope, clothing, and paper. In 1619, the Virginia Assembly passed legislation requiring every farmer to grow hemp. Hemp was allowed to be exchanged as legal tender in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. William Shakespeare may have smoked cannabis. George Washington was thought to grow hemp at Mount Vernon from about 1745 to 1775. He was thought to have a particular interest in the medicinal use of cannabis, and several of his diary entries indicate that he indeed was growing cannabis with a high THC content. In the 1890s, after the Civil War, marijuana was sold in many over-the-counter medicinal products, and hemp was still a common element in clothes manufacturing. The Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in 1906 during the Progressive Era, requiring any product with cannabis in it be labeled appropriately. After the Mexican Revolution in the 1920s, Mexican immigrants migrated to the United States. Recreational use of marijuana spiked, and the drug became associated with the immigrant population. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was established in 1930, and the federal criminalization of marijuana loomed. In 1931, the list of states outlawing marijuana rose to 29 as fear and resentment of Mexican immigrants increased during the Great Depression. In 1936, Reefer Madness, the propaganda film, intent on scaring middle-class white citizens into fearing marijuana use, was released. In the 1950s, federal mandatory minimum sentences for marijuana possession and use was established. In the 1960s, recreational use of marijuana increased and creeped into upper-class America, but its effects were scientifically studied and shown not to induce violence. In the 1970s, many mandatory minimum sentences for marijuana were repealed, and for the first time, marijuana was differentiated from other more harmful drugs. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan promised to get tough on marijuana use and introduced new federal minimum mandatory sentences. In 1996, California's Proposition 215 allowed marijuana to be used as a painkiller for various diseases, including AIDS and cancer. After over a decade of decreasing use, marijuana smoking began an upward trend once more in the early 1990s, especially among teenagers. 2000 to 2011, more than a dozen states voted to decriminalize marijuana for medical uses, but because of federal laws, marijuana use and possession still remained chargeable offenses. In 2012, Washington and Colorado became the first two states to legalize recreational use of marijuana for some adults. The fight still continues today.
Cocaine was first used by Native Americans in the Andean region and was found in coca leaves. They either chewed it in a manner similar to chewing tobacco or brewed the leaves into a tea. Beginning in the 1880s, the drug was starting to be used for anesthetic purposes during surgical processes for the eyes, nose, and throat. It soon began to be utilized as a treatment for mental health disorders such as anxiety and depression, and for addiction treatment for morphine. In the early 1900s, cocaine began to be used in Coca-Cola, as Coca-Cola was invented by the Atlanta pharmacist John Pemberton using coca leaves, sugar syrup, and cola nut extract. He used 2.5 milligrams of cocaine in every 100 milliliters of Coca-Cola. However, public opinion of cocaine began to shift around 1903, and cocaine was eventually removed by Coca-Cola. However, the Coca-Cola company denies any evidence of cocaine being used in their products. In the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914, federal legislation severely restricted the legal uses for cocaine and, for all practical purposes, ended the extensive use and abuse of cocaine in the early part of the 20th century. The use of cocaine began to fade out due to the uprise in amphetamines and became rather dormant in the years following, while other drugs began to become more influential. But due to a rise in counterculture beginning in the 1960s and due to an uprise of casual use and snorting, many began to think it was a casual drug with no petrifying side effects. This began the cocaine epidemic. It was viewed as a recreational drug in the 1970s as well, and high cost and low availability contributed to less use. However, cocaine became increasingly used as a variation called coca paste, which began to be used in South America, and Americans confused its creation with that of freebase cocaine, which quickly began to be used in cocaine trafficking. By 1985, freebase cocaine was marketed as crack, which makes a characteristic popping or crackling sound. Crack cocaine was popularized because of its affordability, its immediate euphoric effect, and its high profitability. Throughout the 1980s, around 8 million cocaine users were American citizens. Around this time, Reagan thought it was necessary to announce the war on drugs and pass legislation such as the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. The cocaine epidemic began to die out by the end of the 1990s and has been declining ever since in America, but continues to haunt communities around the world.
Amphetamine was first made in 1887 in Germany, and methamphetamine was developed in Japan in 1919. Meth went into widespread use during World War II when it was used to keep soldiers, specifically fighter pilots, awake. In the 1950s, methamphetamine was prescribed as a diet aid and an antidepressant throughout the United States. Meth is highly soluble and is often injected. An increase in injections in the 1960s led to a growing problem of abuse. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act restricted production of meth, and as a result, most production and distribution was run by American motorcycle gangs. In the 1990s, Mexican drug traffickers set up meth labs throughout California. These massive drug labs were capable of mass-producing meth, which was then shipped throughout the US, South America, Europe, and Asia.
LSD was created in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann for the purpose of being a blood stimulant. Its hallucinogenic effects were unknown until 1943, when Hofmann accidentally consumed some and experienced vivid hallucinations. Through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, experiments with LSD were done to try and discover a medicinal use for its unique effects, but none were found. The experiment's only effects were the spreading of the drug in popular culture. In the 1960s, LSD was a major part of the counterculture movement, with psychologist Timothy Leary encouraging students to turn on, tune in, and drop out. It was used to ignore problems of American society and rebel against traditional views of adults. In addition to counterculture, LSD was seen as possibly advantageous as a potential chemical weapon. In the 1950s, government intelligence agencies did experiments to see if it could be used to control enemies of the military. The U.S. officially banned the drug in 1967, ending the experiments. Use dropped in the 1980s but rose again in the 1990s as part of dance club rave culture. Use dropped again in the 2000s. LSD is known as a symbol of American youth counterculture and government control with drugs in American history.
Alcohol. The Puritans brought more beer than water on the Mayflower before departing for the New World. The earliest prohibition of spirits was attempted in the colony of Georgia, but failed in the Oglethorpe Experiment of 1733 to 1742. Parliament passed the Molasses Act in 1733 to tax molasses, rum, and sugar into the American colonies from non-British foreign colonies. The first commercial brewster in the New World was a woman named Mary Liesel, who took over her father's brewery in 1734. The Sugar Act of 1764 modified the Molasses Act of 1733 that was about to expire. The new act reduced the tax on molasses but added taxes to sugar. In 1791, Congress passed the Distilled Spirits Act tax, otherwise known as the whiskey tax. The Whiskey Rebellion occurred in Pennsylvania in 1793 as a result of outrage over the tax. The temperance movement continued to spread throughout the U.S., and by 1831, temperance societies were in every state except Alabama, Illinois, Maine, and Missouri. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed in 1873 in Cleveland, Ohio. National prohibition in the U.S. went into effect on January 16, 1920, and lasted until December 5, 1933. During World War II, distillers produced industrial alcohol for the war effort, and by the end of World War II, rum was 3 times more consumed than in 1941. Mothers Against Drunk Driving was established to reduce alcohol-related highway fatalities in 1980. In 2000, Congress required states to establish a maximum blood alcohol concentration for operating motor vehicles of 0.08.
The history of drugs started out as a major part of the economy, helping America grow into an economic power in the world. They evolved into a significant factor in society as they became more widespread throughout the country, contributing to medicine, national health epidemics, and counterculture, as the youth experimented with drugs and rebelled against traditional societal norms. Although in contemporary society they may be a taboo topic of conversation and an overlooked part in our patriotic view of American history, drugs have shaped the foundation of the American economy and society and still have major effects today.